I want to talk about user-authorized discovery, and we'll get into it a little bit but this is I think part of the track was, dream a new dream or something of that nature. This is not something that you go back to your systems and implement tomorrow. This is really about the possibility of how can we improve the user experience for users within whether that's across the web or the enterprise, and make it simpler for them while basically also improving their security and their privacy. So discovery means lots of different things, and I'll talk about a few and I'll skip a few, so you can ask questions if you want at the end. I don't know how many times I've been talking to people here at the conference and they'll ask you, where do you live, right? That's a discovery question, right? And what do we do as individuals? We go through this mind, like, how well do I know this person? How long have I known them? Did I just meet them today, right? Do I tell them my street address or do I tell them I live in Virginia, right? It's a discovery, and we're making a user-authorized decision as to what information we're releasing. Email sharing, right? What happens if someone asks you, hey, I heard you went to Atlantis in the Bahamas, and can you share your photo album with me because I'm thinking about going, right? Well, what's sharing email, what's photo album sharing today, right? It's unguessable URLs. So what do? We go through the same, sort of authorization process in our brains, right? How well do I know this person? What's actually in the photo album? Do I really want to share it with them, right? Those kinds of things. Again, we're making those sorts of decisions in our brains. Bluetooth, right? Maybe it's not so much person-to-person kind of a discovery, right? But there's an authorization component, right? There's a pairing pin. Now, half of them are 00000, but there is supposed to be, right, this mechanism where I, as the user, say, yes, I want those two things connected. NFC tap, another thing. Now, if you look at discovery systems like Bonjour or ZeroConf that it was based on, or maybe even UDDI, right? Those tend to be just sort of public DNS multicast, and you get whatever you get. Whatever sort of plugged into the system, you can discover it, right? Which doesn't allow for any sort of user authorization or control. So there's one more model I want to talk about a little bit. And you might think it's kind of strange from a discovery perspective, but it'll make sense in a minute, I hope, right? Business cards, right? Business card is a discovery mechanism. I choose what information I put on the business card, right? And for me, I actually have two business cards. Well, sort of business cards, right? I have one for my photography stuff that I do, right? And I have another one for work. So what happens? Like, why would I give you one versus the other, right? That's content, right? If you come up and you're talking to me about, hey, I saw that photo, I really liked it, can I go buy a print? Well, I'll give you my photo business card, right? If you're talking about identity standards or want to, talk about something else, right, I may give you my business one. And the information we put on our business cards is selected, right? We don't put our home phone numbers on our business cards, right? So effectively, our business cards become identifiers that we share with somebody, right, for the purpose of them to discover some set of information about us, right? So how does that map into the digital world that we're in, right? What mechanisms do we have in a machine level for taking an identifier, asking for information about the user or device? It doesn't have to be user-centric, but this particular talk, I'm focused on user-centricity or users, but there's nothing that says you couldn't apply this to an entity or an IoT device or anything like that, right? So how can I take some identifier and discover information about that particular identifier for the purposes of making a better user experience? So let me give a couple examples, right? I was thinking about this, thinking about my love for photography, and how many people are at least somewhat familiar with 500px as a photo site? All right, decent number. Okay, so what if when I went to 500px, instead of the process of having to go connect things and hook everything up, I could give 500px a single identifier, right? And it, from that identifier, could find my discovery service and find out that, hey, I want to log in with Google+. All right? So the first piece of information it's going to find from my discovery service is what identity provider do I want to use? That, again, can be context aware. It's a photo site, so I'm going to give it an identity provider where I happen to have a lot of photos, like Google+, right? So I log in. It then basically goes to the discovery service and finds out, where are my friends, right? Because it's going to, it's trying, the standard thing you have, right, when you're trying to build a social network within the context of a particular vertical, right? You want to find additional connections. Well, today, right, I have to do an OAuth 2 flow with Flickr, right? They don't even support Google+. Do an OAuth 2 flow with Flickr to try and pull that in and find followers. What if, in addition, it could find out that, hey, I have a bunch of photos at Flickr, right? Go look at those photos, analyze them, say, and here is 10 photos out of your mastery that's over there at Flickr that we think would be good to start a portfolio at 500px, right? And all of that would happen from a user experience seamlessly for me by the presentation of a single identifier, right? Much simpler than the world we have today. Let's think about another example. I got to make sure I don't hit the button too soon, right? What about some Mint? What about the financial space, right? What happens when you use something like Mint, right? First, I go create an account. Then I add a credit card. Then I add a bank. Then I add a brokerage. Then I add my mortgage. Then I add more of each, right? What if I could give the site or the service a single identifier? It could do discovery. It could find out where my banks are, where my brokerages are, right? Where my credit cards are, and get access to them so that I don't have to go through this process. Now you might think, right, am I crazy? And, in the world that we live in today, maybe so. But dream with me a little bit and see if we can make this a reality, right? Well, what about security, right? I don't want any arbitrary to be able to find out where my bank is and get some token that allows them to access it, right? That's obviously not something we want, right? What about privacy? How do I know who's accessing my bank, right? The problem that Alex was talking about and his friend in the keynote yesterday, right, was that his friends, people were trying to social engineer his phone site. He had no idea, right? So where's the audibility? Where's the transparency? How does that work in a system like this? And obviously, oops, I see the button. Obviously, I want some control over the sharing, right? How do I expose this information under some level of control that I'm in charge of so that I can ensure that the right people get access to the right data at the right time for the right length of time? Now, it may seem like this is an impossibility, but I think that there are things that we can leverage today that actually bring this a whole lot closer in reality than some far-field dream, 10 years in the future. So I want to look at two standards today. One of them is Webfinger. How many people know what Webfinger is? All right, just a few, right? And the other is user-managed access. I'm sure most of you have at least heard the term from this conference. So I want to talk a little bit about both of these and how we might leverage them to build a system that actually improves user experience. So what is Webfinger? Well, I'll just give you a quick introduction to both of these protocols, right? Webfinger has the concept of a resource identifier and a relationship. And effectively what you're doing is you're querying for this particular resource identifier, what are all the things that meet this relationship? In this particular example here, right, the relationship is the OpenID Connect discovery relationship identifier URL. So effectively what this is saying, for resource identifier George at discover.example.com, what is his OpenID Connect provider? The response basically has the subject, which in this case is the same thing. Webfinger has the concept of supporting aliases. So if you want to think about pseudonymous identifiers or other mechanisms from a privacy perspective, we can go into that. I'm not going that deep today. And what it can get back is effectively a list of links. A link has the relationship, right, what you were looking for, the endpoint of where that relationship exists. In this case, right, my OpenID provider is at openidprovider.example.com. And you can have any number of arbitrary properties. This is actually a pretty awesome capability from the protocol, and I think could really be leveraged in a lot of things when it comes to discovery. In this particular case, I've given a property that says the login hint is gfletch. So if you follow me at all, right, that's my handle pretty much everywhere. So what this effectively says is, if you notice, the value gfletch is different from the resource identifier. So I've effectively decoupled my login credentials at the identity provider from my discovery identifier, right? And if I have 3 different identity providers, right, I can have different usernames or login hints, so to speak, at each of those. So there's a lot of power here, and we'll talk a little bit about this at the end. UMA basically is OAuth 2 plus a little bit, or maybe plus a lot, depending on how you want to think about it. You have the resource owner, the person who wants to share something, right? You have the actual resource. In this case, if you want to think about it, let's think about the resource server as being the discovery service, okay? You have the authorization server, which is going to make decisions about whether something can be released from the resource server. From the previous examples, you could think about this a little bit in the dynamic model world, where we have a centralized authorization. You have the client that's actually making the request. And then the piece that's really new to UMA is this requesting party. And if you think about OAuth 2 as it stands today, right, it's me sharing, it's me giving authorization, delegated authorization access to some other party to access my data, right? I can't say I want to define an authorization policy that allows Jerry to see my data, right, or Justin to see my data. There isn't any support for that in OAuth 2. And UMA adds this capability of defining authorization policy that includes the requester as in addition to a bunch of other extended capabilities. So basically, you get things like, I want to share my stuff among my own apps, with my family and friends, with organizations. I got interested in UMA specifically around effectively what we call in the UMA working group person-to-person sharing, because those unguessable URLs for sharing family photos drive me nuts. And I want a system where I can actually share a family photo album. Actually, my dream, which is sort of available today if you cobble everything together, is that I stick a digital photo frame in my parents' house, right? I take a picture of my kids, I upload it to a folder, it appears on their frame, and it's all 100% secure. I'll talk more about UMA in a workshop on Thursday. Basically, effectively, the piece here is I want to control access proactively. So one other piece that's really important about UMA that it gives is it gives pre-consent. If you think about OAuth 2, consent is always given in the context of the flow. And UMA gives you a way to basically say, I want to allow, I'm going to pre-authorize Justin to access that photo stream, right? That you can't really do in OAuth 2. So what if we combine these two together? What if we basically said, let's UMA protect, so to speak, the Webfinger protocol? What would that mean, and how would that look like, and what would it give us, right? The user gets to decide what resources are discoverable. They get to decide the authorization policy as to who's allowed to discover it, right? And because of the way UMA is organized, you can do transparency and audit capabilities. So I have a very simple, standard, maybe nauseating enterprise example, right? Calendar sharing. And in this particular case, since we're talking about the discovery part of it, we'll just assume that Alice is going to hand Bob, right, a business card that instead of having 15 pieces of information on it, has a single piece of information on it, which is effectively her discovery identifier. All right? To sort of set this up in the sense of preconditions, right, Alice effectively has to ensure that her the endpoints of her calendar service are registered with the UMA AS. The discovery service sort of registers that, and that she defines the authorization policy. So in this particular example, she's going to authorize Bob to see her calendar for the period of 1 week so that he can schedule a meeting with her. All right? And I'm just going to go through the discovery piece of this and how it would work. As an engineer, I always like to know the stuff I talk about actually works. So I won't bore you to death too much with sequence diagrams and syntax and the nitty-gritty of things, but at least hopefully this will give you some confidence that this is maybe a closer reality than what it seems like. So here we go. We've got Alice's calendar service, we've got her UMA service that is managing her authorization policy, you've got her discovery service, you've got Bob and Bob's calendar client. All right, so it sort of goes like this. Here's my discovery identifier, pass it down to the client, right? The client basically says, hey, discovery service, where's Alice's calendar endpoint? And the discovery service, since it's UMA protected, goes, hey, UMA authorization server, someone's trying to access Alice's calendar endpoint. What do I do? Oh, they need to come talk to me for a minute. Come send them over here, and here's a token, in UMA it's called the permission ticket. Here's the token to use when you send them over so I know what the context is of the authorization I need to apply. Authorization policy that needs to be met. All right, so please visit Alice's authorization server with this token, right? Okay, hey, I'm Bob. I can get access, can I please get access to Alice's calendar information? The UMA protocol has a number of ways for this to work. You can either redirect Bob to the UMA authorization server, or you can, basically if the calendar client, let's say, has an OpenID Connect ID token, it could potentially push that straight at the UMA authorization server and not, force Bob through yet more redirects, right? In this case, Alice configured her authorization service to say, please notify me or ask me anytime someone wants to access my calendar, right? This is a dotted line because it's outside the UMA spec, but pretty easy to implement, right? So Alice says, sure, no problem, and then, hey Bob, right? Here's a token. Use this token when you go try and find Alice's calendar endpoint. All right? So now, I really don't like this clicker. The Alice's calendar endpoint, where is it? Here's my token, right? The token it just got from the UMA authorization service. Hey, is this token valid for Alice's calendar endpoint? Oh, by the way, Alice, Bob just accessed your calendar endpoint, right? Here it is, and I subscribe. All right? Standard UMA, standard Webfinger, put together. Webfinger spec explicitly says you probably should have some form of client authentication on the calls to Webfinger, but it's out of scope. So conveniently, yeah, it's pretty close. Conveniently, right, this gives us a mechanism for combining these things. So what does this give us from a solution perspective and what's missing, right? For one, it gave us transparency. Alice knew whenever Bob was trying to access her calendar endpoint, right, and subscribe. And by the way, you could UMA protect Alice's calendar service, and it would just be, as we say in the protocol world, turtles all the way down. Effectively, it's just the same flow, but at the calendar service endpoint instead of the discovery service endpoint. So you got transparency. You got the ability for the UMA service to audit it, right? You've got an authorization policy. You've got privacy in the sense that Alice is restricting who can actually see the data. Not if Eve or Mallory came and tried to access her calendar endpoint, the UMA authorization service would say, no, you're not allowed to, and that would be it, right? Nothing's exposed. As far as sort of what's missing, right, to make this more of a reality, if you notice, there was a relationship. OpenID Connect Discovery defined one relationship. But within a vertical, like if we were going to do the Mint example, you would need a bunch of relationships defined within that vertical, right, that everybody would sort of agree to. So that's a piece that's missing. Discover.me is actually a Park domain. But we need some level of identifier now. Some level of identifier to represent the user. Again, like I said, if you're really concerned about pseudonymity, is that the way you say that? Someone can correct me afterwards. You can do this. You could do that with these protocols. You need to be able to mix public and private. As we were discussing this on the UMA working group listserv, Justin pointed out that there's probably some things that need to be better defined as to how to make some of that information public, some things discovered publicly, and in a way to do that well in UMA. The registration of discovery endpoints as resource sets is actually probably simpler. Still, there is no definition for it, but that I don't think is a huge problem. This second to the last one is actually pretty powerful, and it actually goes specifically to Jerry's authorization token service, right? If you think about, because I'm talking to the UMA authorization service, and if the thing I'm trying to access is UMA protected, that UMA authorization service could return a property, like just as we saw the login hint property, could return a property which is, and here's your access token to access that service, right? So now, by going to the discovery service, not only do I get the endpoint, I get the token that allows me to access it, right? Think how much that would simplify the amount of work we have to do from a protocol level as well as the user experience. And then finally, we have authorization overload, right? I think that is a different problem. This doesn't necessarily help that. I think there's some really interesting issues that we have to address in the sense of how do I determine all these relationships I already have and maybe get some way to handle them and manage them. And that, I think, is something that's a little bit outside the context of this particular talk. So with that, I will close, and there should be some time for questions. Thank you very much. Any questions?
So you said it's a potential problem, right, to manage all of these authorizations and to make users aware of all of that data information that are floating out. But I mean, you can't solve that on a protocol level, but if you come up with a system like this and it works, you will run into trouble, right? So have you thought about this, and do you see any way forward? I mean, manageability of all of these permissions is a big problem.
It is a big problem, though I think where you will get to is a little bit the way that we're trying to address some of the security things, right, which is anomaly detection, right? So if you have an UMA authorization server or some other sort of centrally managed authorization mechanism from a consumer perspective, or maybe even from an enterprise perspective, right, there's probably going to be best practice rules that are built in, right? And so for the most part, you don't get notified unless something happens, right? A little bit like we set up our bank accounts, right? Notify me if there's a transaction that's over this amount. So I think that we're going to have to grow in that world because nobody wants to manage all this stuff, right? And keep track of it. But like how many people on a regular basis, let's say like when you change the batteries in your smoke detectors, go to Facebook, Flickr, or any other sort of social site and check which apps you've given access to access your data and find out that you don't actually use them anymore and revoke access. Anybody do that on a regular basis? All right, we got two, right? The two, yes, not surprising, the two people who raised their hands, right? So we have that problem, right? What if I could just tell the system, if I haven't used that app, right, in 3 months, revoke access, right? And then I'm not managing on a day-to-day basis. I'm letting the system do it, and then notify me when there's some sort of anomaly or unexpected behavior. And I think that's where we have to grow. Now that probably is a ways out there in the future, but otherwise there is no way to manage the data complexity. Justin?
So do you think that it's reasonable to start on that with coming up with good guidelines and good defaults for policies? Because most people, including myself most of the time, don't go dinking around with the finer details of authorization policies. And so, revoking gross access to an application is too much trouble for all but the most paranoid users, as you just pointed out.
Right. So this is exactly, I think, what Patrick was talking about in relationship to Uma in his keynote this morning, right? Which is that, because Justin, you're pointing out, it's a user experience problem, right? And we have to get that user experience problem correct. So yes, I think there will be, right, stoplight, red, green, like how protected do you want yourself to be? Or here's the default best practice photo sharing policy, and oh, by the way, we'll go pull your circles from Google+, and you can just assign, right, user authorization or user access lists based on your circles in Google+, right, or something of that nature. It has to be very simple for a user, and there has to be best practices, and I think that in this space is really where the innovation is going to be, right, to make that a really simple and easy to use and something that we as consumers want to use, because without that, it's not going to work.